There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
There's a lot you don't know about Leigh Sales. Sure, you know that she's possibly the most outstanding journalist of her generation, that she's been hosting the ABC's flagship news and current affairs program 7:30 for 12 years, where she's interviewed 5 sitting prime ministers, several ex-prime ministers, and every celebrity and sports person you've ever heard of. You also probably know that she's Australia's most famous redhead and that she's a podcast icon, thanks to the show that she co-hosts with her friend Annabelle Crabb called Chat 10 Looks 3. You might also know that she's written several best-selling books, including Any Ordinary Day. I've bought at least a dozen copies of that book to give to people after they've experienced sudden tragedies because it is one of the most brilliant and helpful books that I've ever read. All that stuff, it's well and truly on the public record. But do you know that she's a single mother? That she nearly died during childbirth? That she knows virtually nothing about sport but has had amusing text banter with everyone from Shane Warne to Justin Langer after she interviewed them? Or that she nearly lost her mind with excitement when she got to interview Paul McCartney? Because you also probably didn't know that she is a massive music nerd and she loves nothing more than to open her piano at home and bang out a show tune. You probably didn't know that both John Howard and Malcolm Turnbull both called her to express their condolences after her father died very suddenly a few years ago. And did you know that she didn't use serums until a couple of weeks ago when I shamed her into taking better care of her skin at age 48 and demanded that she start using both vitamin C and retinol? I know a lot about Leigh Sales because after meeting on Twitter around a decade ago, she has become one of my closest and most beloved friends. This is the 4th time she's been a guest on No Filter, and not even Glennon Doyle or Liz Gilbert has been on that many times, which says a lot about how interesting Leigh Sales is. So, why again? What everyone wants to know most about Leigh Sales right now is why she's leaving the most high-profile and prestigious job in Australian journalism. Why is she walking away from hosting 7:30 when she is inarguably on top of her game? Is it the trolls? Is it work-life balance? Was she cancelled? Is she, in fact, having extensive plastic surgery so that she can retreat from the public eye for a life of anonymity? Leigh Sales, the people have questions, and I'm here to ask them. When did you find out that you were going to be the host of 7:30? Do you remember the day?
I do. It was late 2010. I think it was maybe late November 2010. And I'd had some talks with Mark Scott, the head of the ABC at the time, and Kate Tawney, who was the head of news at the time. And I wasn't 100% sure that they wanted me to do it. And then Kate rang me to say, we'd like you to do it and we'd like Chris Ullman to be the political editor. So it was kind of a new broom coming through. And it was thrilling because, you know, it's such a big and key job, but it was also scary because I was coming in behind Kerry O'Brien, who'd been doing it for a really, really long time. And I have such a different kind of vibe to Kerry. It was like, okay, this is going to be hard. And I remember saying to Mark and Kate, I need you to agree that you'll back me in for 3 years because I think the audience will need 3 years to adapt to having a new person there. Because even, you know, when someone good is replaced by somebody good, change is hard for television audiences. And so they were great. So I started out with a 3-year contract so that I had that assurance, and it was really good.
But what if you'd been a bit shit?
Then I guess they would have found a way out of it.
Was it something that you had to audition for? Were there a few people in the running for it? What were you doing before you took that role?
So before I was doing it, I was hosting Late Line, and this was a show that used to go to air at 10:30 at night, and it was shared between myself and Tony Jones. He hosted Late Line and Q&A, and I did the other days of Late Line. And it was a program not dissimilar to 7:30, but longer, and it had longer interviews. So the interviews would always be about 15 minutes, which for 7:30, 15 minutes is usually something really major. Like I had the head of the Reserve Bank the other day, and that was 15 minutes. Late Line, everyone, 15 minutes. So I was having a lot of practice of doing the kinds of things that you do on 7:30 on Late Line. So I guess that was just an on-air, maybe an off-Broadway kind of audition. They knew my work, so I didn't have to audition. And usually I think when you get to this level, you're only being looked at if your work's very well known already. And so it was just a case of us talking through what I thought of the show at the time and what I would like to do. And yeah, it kind of went from there. So it was just a conversation really.
It was obviously a big commitment in terms of 4 days a week. What are the hours of 7:30?
So it's kind of, like a lot of media jobs, it's 24/7 really. So I wake up in the morning and I immediately have to check, what's in the news, because the morning's when you set up the day. So if you need reporters on stories straight away, or if you need to get bids in for people, that's when you're doing it. So that's quite a busy time. From about 6:30, I'm looking at a lot of newspapers and making calls and juggling that now with my kids. And then 9 a.m. we have an editorial conference call where we're talking about what might be on the show and what our options are. And then between usually about 9:15 and 11 o'clock or so, and that's my kind of quiet time where I can usually go to the gym or do something, depends what I've got going on. And then things start changing. So, for example, I kept you waiting because I was on the phone to the executive producer because we just got word that one interview we were going for is not happening, but another one is. And so Clay, who's acting EP at the moment, wanted to have a quick chat to me about what he thought we should touch on in the interview, and I was talking about what I thought. So now that I know that that's my interview, it'll be, okay, now I prep for that, and then I'm simultaneously prepping for an interview tomorrow with Dylan Alcott, so trying to get that out of the way, and then juggling whatever else is on the show. And then I'll head to makeup about 4. My interview's at 5:15 today. And then once I've done that interview, then I have a look at the leads for the other stories and any other content, or we talk about any other issues. We might have a quick chat about what's coming up tomorrow. And then you do the show live and then off you go. But between now, 11:30 and 7:30 tonight, all of that could be completely out the window because it's dictated by news events. So it's a rolling, movable feast, basically.
When I prepped for our conversation today, my prep involved asking in a group chat with you and 2 other of our friends who are journalists, what should my first question be? How is that different to your process when you're, say, interviewing anyone?
Do you know what? I actually think what you did, that is a great process, because particularly if you talk to people who, so let's say for you, maybe our WhatsApp group, you think, okay, women like that, that's the audience for this podcast. So what they're interested in knowing from Leigh is what my audience would be interested in knowing.
Yeah.
So I'm doing a very similar thing for 7:30, which is I'm thinking, what would the average person sitting at home who watches my show like me to ask if they're in my position? So say, for example, I mentioned earlier that I interviewed last week the governor of the Reserve Bank, Phil Lowe. It's unprecedented, basically, for him to do a TV interview like that. So I was thinking, okay, what are people thinking about? And how I inform myself for that is I talk to my friends who aren't in politics and the media. I have lots of conversations with, if I'm at the local cafe, the guy who's working behind there, and I ask him how is his business going and is he worried about interest rates? Or if I'm sitting in a doctor's surgery or if I'm in a cab or whatever, I just talk to people all the time so that I have a sense of what regular people think about, not people like me who consume media, all day, every day. So I guess it's the equivalent of like a WhatsApp group chat, but just on a bigger kind of real life scale.
Mm. You interview everyone from prime ministers to sports people to the Beatles, Paul McCartney. There are some of those topics that you know more about and some of those that you know less about, sport. How do you prep, on the day of the Melbourne Cup, you usually have to interview the winner. How do you prep for that? You know nothing about horse racing.
Do you know what's really embarrassing? I reckon if you went back and watched all my Melbourne Cup interviews over the years, it's probably about the same 4 questions. It'll be like, so what was going through your mind in that final 100 metres? And wow, it's just such an amazing thing to win. I mean, you must be so thrilled. But it's kind of like prepping for anything in that everyone always has their own individual story. So with Melbourne Cup, it's always a real relief if you discover that, the jockey's just come back from an accident, or Michelle Payne was the best ever because it was a female jockey and her brother was the strapper and their dad and their mum had died. Like, it was a great story. So you had a lot to work with. Where it's sport is harder for me is if it's more technical about what was, involved in the race rather than the person's human story. And usually I'm trying to pull it onto the human terrain because I think not everyone at home knows about the intricacies of horse racing. They want to connect with the story as a human being. And I think, whether it's the governor of the Reserve Bank or the person who won the Melbourne Cup, if you can find a way to talk on a level that everyone else who's not an expert in that field can relate to, then you're on much better terrain. So, for example, sometimes I'll send back, when I was more in news and occasionally I'd fill in as a newsreader, I'd sometimes send back a lead to people in sport because I'd go, I can't even tell what sport this is about, because it would be the Boomers smashed the Opals in a thrilling touchdown, blah, blah, like, what sport is this? And so there's so much jargon in sport and so much assumed knowledge. And same with finance, like the footsie and the hung sen, blah, blah.
Yeah.
What? Like, I don't know what that means.
So it's always about walking in the shoes of the audience and not bringing assumed knowledge.
I think so. Or some things you can kind of assume, I guess, like you can assume that people know who Shane Warne is maybe, but maybe you want to try to explain why is Shane Warne such a famous cricketer? Like, people who don't know about cricket, they might not quite understand what made him different to a regular cricketer. So I try really hard, particularly with subjects I know really well, like, say, foreign policy or trashy television. I try to not assume that everybody else knows, what I know about it.
When you're interviewing those people, it's only politicians who are the ones that usually push back, although that's maybe not true. You've had to do some, I won't say antagonistic, but usually when you're interviewing someone, they won't try and deliberately mislead you, divert you, filibuster you.
No.
What are the specific approaches that you need to take when you're interviewing a politician?
So a politician usually differs to a regular interviewee in that you know that they're not going to engage in an open kind of way. They're not going to let you in on everything that's going on behind the scenes. They're going to have a message that they're going to want to try to get out. And sometimes it's interesting to know what their message is. So say, for example, Anthony Albanese is due to come on 7:30 next week for his first interview as Prime Minister. And so I haven't interviewed him before. He hasn't been in the job long, so he doesn't have a record. So it won't be an interview where, it's not an accountability interview where he's not going to be under pressure like a regular political interview. It'll be an interview where I'm trying to actually hear what Anthony Albanese's message is and what his ambitions are for his term. Because if I were remaining as anchor of 7:30, I'd be using that interview for the next 3 years as my kind of flagpoles in the ground interview to see, well, right at the start, you said that this is what you wanted to do and what you wanted to achieve. Here you are at point A and now we're at point Z. And how did you get so far off what you said you were going to do, kind of thing. So sometimes you do want to hear what their message is and what they're saying. And then other times you want to get to the bottom of a change in policy or something that they've done wrong. And so I'll try to arm myself with facts to then rebut what I think their spin, might be. Whereas with a normal person, say, I love how I've referred to politicians as not normal people, but say with like Dylan Alcott, for example, I mentioned before that I'm prepping for an interview tomorrow. Now, Dylan Alcott is a really great talker. He's very charismatic and charming. And so I assume if I ask interesting, engaging questions that perk up Dylan's interest, and if we have nice rapport, that I'm not going to have to work very hard as an interviewer. I'm just going to have to give him a gentle steer in the right direction, listen to what he's saying and respond so that it feels like a natural kind of conversation. So every interview that I go into, I'm thinking, okay, what's the tone I need with this? How do I make this person feel at ease? Or how do I achieve, again, what the average person at home might want to see out of this interview?
When you went from being, I guess, a working journalist to being more of a star journalist, when you started hosting 7:30 and you were in people's lounge rooms 4 nights a week, plus on all the promos, plus in the media everywhere and ads and all of those things, when did you notice the transition between people. I mean, I imagine you had a little bit of it when you were hosting Lateline, but it was really like prime time A-list.
Yeah.
How did you notice the transition about how you were perceived, how people interacted with you, becoming a famous person?
So the longer I've done it, the more this has become notable to me. So now I would rarely leave the house and not have somebody come up to me and want to chat to me or want to have a selfie or whatever. So whereas, the first few years I felt kind of like I still could go out and not be noticed. Maybe I was kidding myself because sometimes what happens is I'll sit in a cafe and no one will say something, and then on social media later someone might go, oh, I just saw you sitting in a cafe and I didn't want to say anything, but, blah, blah, blah. So maybe I was more noticed than I thought, but I have become very conscious of it. And it might also be because I'm leaving. So now people are just so lovely because they want to come up and they want to go, I just want to say thank you very much, and, that kind of thing. And also just the range of people now who come up to me, like it can be quite young people in their late teens or early 20s. It can be older people that you perceive as more traditional ABC viewers. I was walking down George Street the other night on a Friday night at about 10:30, and there was this group of young guys. I would have never thought they knew who I was. And one of them yelled out, oh, my God, Leigh Sales, I fucking love you. I was just like, wow, I so did not perceive you guys as my demographic. At the Logies, it's often really weird because you're mixing with all these other famous people from other networks. And so the people who sometimes out themselves as major fans is really surprising to me. So one Logies a few years ago, I was going to the toilet and I bumped into Gary Sweet, and he stopped me and was like, oh my God, I cannot believe I bumped into you. Oh my God, I'm your biggest fan. And he was really awkward. And then this Logies, do you know the actor James Stewart who's on Home and Away?
Yeah.
So Georgie Parker, Australian television royalty, came up to me and went, I'm really sorry to disturb you, but James is your biggest fan and could he please get a photo with you? I'll take it. I was just like, oh, that's completely fine. Yep, no problem. And so we got a photo. He's like, Leigh, oh my God, it's so great to meet you. I'm so embarrassed. And so he was just like awkward fanboying. And then we kind of moved through and ended up colliding, again at the other end. And I said to him, I'm just always amazed that somebody like you would even know who I am. And so he was like, our mum raised us right. We watched 7:30. And so, yeah, so that was a classic. So sometimes you're kind of surprised by who's a big fan. I remember interviewing Guy Pearce in 2011 when I was first in the show. And because, I grew up in that Neighbours era, he was such a heartthrob when we were kids. And when I walked in, he clearly was a massive viewer and fan of Lateline. And, to the degree where he was like, he was still married at the time, he was saying, oh, Kate and I noticed that you've changed your hair and you used to have the short bob on Lateline and now you've grown longer, and we were wondering why. And I was like, because I look too much like Julia Gillard with the short red bob. And we sat around yapping for ages after the interview, and then we caught up again in 2018 because he's just a religious viewer of 7:30. And then we stayed friends because we just hit it off and we were buddies. So it blows my mind. I'm like, oh my God, Guy Pearce is sitting on film sets around the world watching 7:30 every opportunity he can. Or Ben Mendelsohn is another person who one time we had a story, and this is lovely when this kind of thing happens. Ben Mendelsohn was in the US shooting, what was the show where they were at the luxury kind of hotel that the family runs, and the guy from Friday Night Lights was in it. I can't remember what it was called,
and it's like swampy. Yeah.
Swampy, it's in Florida, yeah.
Blood something, something blood.
Exactly, yeah. Bloodline or something, yeah. And Ben Mendelsohn's the kind of wayward brother. Anyway, we had this gorgeous story on the show about this kind of disco that was being held for teenagers who had disabilities, like all different kind of disabilities. And it was organised by one of the mums because she said they're still teenagers. They still want to meet somebody that they might fancy and have a bit of romance in their life, but we can't let them go out like normal teenagers do because they too easily get taken advantage of and it's just not safe. And so we've created this disco for them. It's a safe kind of space. And so they've got a caterer and a DJ and stuff. And the kids, we had one of our producers, Leslie Robinson, sort of follow these kids through. And it was just the most gorgeous story. And the kids were just so excited. And it was just absolutely adorable. And the mum, she only had money to do one. And then Ben Mendelsohn saw it watching in LA, and he got in contact with us and said, I'll pay for another one. Like, just get it organised and I'll pay for the whole thing. Oh, wow. So they then were able to have a second one that Ben shouted. He did an interview a few years later about something, and I actually asked him before the interview, can I ask you about that on camera? Because I think it's a great message to send to people of means. If you see something on our show and you can make a difference, well, just ring us and you can. And so Ben talked about how he watched it and he was really touched by it, and he just thought, I can spare $5,000 to do that. And he said to other people they should. I won't name them because I don't want to embarrass them, but there's a well-known, quite well-loved Australian businessman who often gets in touch to say, families who've lost their homes or whatever, he'll pay their rent for 6 months. And so that's really heartening, when that kind of thing happens.
Was there anyone at the Logies that you were fangirling over?
Often it's the kids entertainers, because it thrills my kids if they see me with them. So I had a photo with Emma Wiggle, and I was chatting to Hamish Blake. I didn't take a photo with Hamish, but they love Lego Masters. So I've said to Hamish, you'll have to come over for dinner sometime. I didn't warn him that the kids are going to basically monopolise him and hide him in the bedroom for the entire period to build Lego with them, but he probably would be fine with that. So yeah, so it's usually the kids people. Jimmy Giggle, I got a photo with one year, and I just text the photos home and go, oh, here's a photo for the kids.
When obviously people recognising you in public, you're in a cafe or whatever, it's fine. There have been some times when you've been in very vulnerable situations, like when you nearly died giving birth. What's that like? Do you have an awareness in situations where you are really powerless or vulnerable, or in a really private situation that happens to be public? Is your celebrity in the room?
Yeah, and because I never assume that people know who I am, because I think that would just be up myself. So I don't want to say things like, oh, look, I need an extra level of privacy because, I'm famous. So I usually am hoping that someone else might intervene on my behalf and say, oh, Leigh might prefer to be, blah, blah, blah. And people normally are very respectful. Like I was in hospital one time with my son who was in hospital. There was a family in the bed next to us with a little boy who had a tumour, and the mother recognised me, but she didn't raise it with me. She raised it with my son's father. And so, she clearly didn't want to kind of raise it. It kind of made me feel a little bit awkward, but it also made me feel good because she knew who I was because she was a fan of Chat 10 Looks 3, the podcast I do with Annabelle, and she listened to that. And so I got on the phone to Gwen, who does our merchandise, and said, oh, there's this, because, I'd been hearing like the little boy was in a lot of pain. I said to Gwen, can you just quickly bang together a merchandise pack of Chat 10 gear that I can give to the mum? And so my ex-husband actually took it in and gave it to her. I don't think I actually spoke to her after she knew who I was. He said, oh, she nearly cried, like she was so happy about it. And so that kind of stuff is really nice if you feel like, because you just know that someone's having the bloody worst few days of their life. And so if you can sling them a stupid apron with my ugly mug on it, that makes you feel kind of good. But then other times, I remember once in the street, a woman stopped me and she said, oh, I was a nurse and, when you're in intensive care, and I remember, you were asleep, and I said to another nurse, oh my God, it's Leigh Sales. And it was I felt like actually kind of that it was gigantically inappropriate.
Yeah.
99 times out of 100 people are just really awesome, to me, and they are very respectful and it's fine.
You're not someone who pops up in the gossip columns. A million people odd watch 7:30 4 nights a week. Millions of people watch you on big ticket items like the election coverage. You are one of the most recognisable faces in Australia, and yet you're not in the gossip columns. Why not?
I think because I'm pretty boring. And also I just try to keep myself under the radar. So I do go to, the occasional opening night of things, but I don't for example, I don't go out to cool places with dates. I go to daggy suburban pubs and, things like that. So I think that the kind of life I live doesn't really invite, I don't live at Bondi, for example. I'm not eating out at Potts Point all the time. I'm not in places very often where you'd be seen. I mean, I do go to pains to not have details about my family and private life out there because I think it's not fair on the people around me. So I do work pretty hard to, not be seen with people. And to be honest, not that I date, an endless parade of people, but I don't want my kids ever Googling, oh, there's one with that guy, and there's one with that guy, and there's one with that guy. I just would rather keep all of my private business private. So, yeah, I think I just, I keep it under the radar.
You got quietly divorced a few years ago. no more dramas there. How does someone date Leigh Sales? Like, what sort of guy has the confidence to ask you out?
I think you've got to be reasonably confident to actually do that. But I also think that most people, once they meet me and kind of get to know me, I think fairly rapidly I'm not very intimidating. I think what people find hard sometimes is the way other people interact with them. So, for example, I've been out with men where people have said to them, wow, you must have felt intimidated asking Leigh out. And so the message that they're getting is you're punching above your weight. And I think that's a hard message for men to get. And so, you know, that's not the message I give people that I'm in relationships with or dating, but I think that they sometimes feel very heavily scrutinized. And I know even, you know, my ex-husband, things like, you know, we'd check in somewhere to be, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Sales or whatever, which isn't his name. So just this assumption that the person is kind of just your add-on, and sometimes they're treated a little bit like that. I think that can be kind of confronting for people. And just the level of people looking you up, like literally looking you up and down, like spotting me and then looking the person I'm with up and down. And that's, you know, again, there's nothing you can really do about it. It's natural kind of human curiosity. But I often feel sorry for people that I'm with in that situation. And so, for example, say red carpet events, I generally would prefer to take a friend because I don't want to subject some poor bugger to that level of scrutiny.
Did you take a date to the Oscars? No.
To the Logies.
Oh,
no,
to the Logies, sorry, not the Oscars.
No, you don't. You don't get to take a partner to the Logies unless you're Hamish Blade.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with Leigh Sales. So the time that you've been hosting on 7:30, the world's changed in terms of social media. And as a journalist and a working journalist, how have you seen that change? How have you experienced that change? Because back in the day, it used to be if someone had a problem, they would, I don't know, ring the ABC, or they would write a letter, which they would have to get a stamp for. And then, of course, there was email. Now the whole performative side of things has come in with social media.
Yeah.
How have you experienced that shift? Like, when do you remember thinking, oh, this is different?
I definitely remember, and this is a long time ago, back in 2005, being just blown away by changing technology. I was covering Hurricane Katrina, and my producer at the time was an American guy called Jason Raki, and we were at New Orleans airport, and we went outside onto like a kind of grassy area outside the airport, and he had, you know, what we would now think of as just like a wireless toggle that he shoved into the USB on the side of the laptop, and we filed voice reports and we sent them from the field. Now, that was the first time ever that I hadn't had to go back to find a phone line to plug into to send audio material back. And I remembered thinking, this is unbelievable. This is a complete game changer. And so that for me was a real moment of thinking how much things changed. I think, you know, and then technology moved really fast. But then, of course, during the pandemic, when we all had to adapt to using technology differently, even the way you and I are doing this podcast now, where I'm sitting at my house, you're in your office, it's all professionally recorded. Like, we've all had to learn to do that. I did 7:30 out of my bedroom down the hallway. So that was another moment of thinking, wow, this is an incredible, you know, uptick. And then also, of course, there's been the rise of, you know, social media. And I think probably around, it's definitely been since my colleague Mark Colvin died, which was in 2017. Because I remember when Mark was alive, we were never talking about Twitter being a nasty, vicious kind of place and that it wasn't hyper partisan. And Mark was like a very, very voracious user of Twitter. And so it's definitely happened since then. So I in my head, I think something's changed since Mark died, where that platform in particular has become just a kind of hate-fueled, hyper-partisan sort of place. And so I think that what's happened is that platform, which really I don't know anyone on it other than journos. Like in my world, say, for example, you know, I come from Brisbane. My friends range from teachers to police officers, secretaries, university workers, and so on. None of them are on Twitter, and none of them are aware, for example, of the level of abuse that gets meted out at female journalists on Twitter just for doing their job. And so the only people who ever raise with me Twitter or abuse on Twitter, social media abuse, are actually other journos, because so many journos are on Twitter. And so their assumption is, oh, well, this represents the world. Everyone's on Twitter. Whereas the ABC actually, we did some research last year, and I think we found something like, say, 9 out of 100 people use Twitter regularly. Hardly anybody is on there. When you think about it as well, like people who are particularly active, who can sit on a social media platform all day and commentate on what's on ABC News Breakfast, or commentate, all day on somebody's newspaper column. I mean, what do you do for a job, or what's going on in your life that actually you have that much time that you can devote to that? So by its nature, it can't possibly be representative. A lot of that stuff that I think preoccupies journalists around the importance of Twitter and, what's trending on Twitter and what people are saying on Twitter is actually not very important. And it's afforded way too much power and influence in the media, in my view, based on how much real people actually use it.
There have been a lot of erroneous reports around the fact that you're leaving 7:30 because of Twitter trolling. It's a pretty easy story.
Yes.
I've actually never heard you complain or be worried or do anything other than eye roll about Twitter trolls. How do you think this has sort of become the narrative?
Well, I just think that, again, because journos are on Twitter all the time and they would see, the level of abuse that I get, they think that, it must be because, she's getting abused. Hamish Blake, when I announced I was leaving, sent me this really interesting and lovely text message, and he said, people often have a really hard time understanding when somebody's choosing to leave a great job at the top of their game of their own choosing. And he said they assume that there must be a secret reason, like you must have a new job or a secret thing lined up, or there must be something secretly going on in your life that nobody knows about, or you must be getting pushed. And he said, but when I see someone announce, what you've just announced, I feel nothing but excitement for them that they've taken control of that situation. They've made an empowered decision, and now there's fresh fields ahead and something to do. And when I got it, I thought, because my text messages were just full of people going, oh my God, wow, that's huge. And Hamish actually, I thought, yes, he 100% gets it. He totally gets why I'm going. And so I think a lot of people have been casting around looking for, well, what's the real reason? Because who could possibly give up this job in the position she's in now? But the reality is that I do enjoy the job and I do really like it. But I said to Kate and Mark right at the start that I thought it was about a 10-year job. And I've been doing it now for coming up to 11 and a half. And so I never have wanted to be somebody who waits till they're kind of stale and people want them to go. I wanted to go when I felt like I was at a really good position. And, I was incredibly grateful when I told the head of the ABC, David Anderson, and Justin Stevens, who was at the time the 7:30 EP and is now the head of news, and Gavin Fang, who was the acting head of news. They all said variations of, is there anything we can say to change your mind? Like, we would love you to keep doing it, but we assume that you've thought it through a lot if you've come to us. And I really, really appreciated that was the response that I got. And that actually helped me understand I've judged this right. Because what I didn't want was to ever go and them to go, great, thank you so much, because, they've wanted me to disappear. And so honestly, people keep asking me all the time, what are you going to, what do you want to do? And when I say, I don't know, I want to have a break, I want to have a rest and see what brews up, people have a hard time believing that. So I keep reading this erroneous speculation as well about what I'm going to do, that I'm going to do a talk show. I've never pitched that. The ABC's never offered it. There's been no discussion about it. I actually think a show of that nature would not work in Australia. So I'm not doing that. The Twitter stuff, like, the Daily Telegraph on the weekend and the Herald Sun ran this story that was with a headline that was an utter fabrication. And it was indirect quotes saying, trolls forced me out of the job I love.
Yeah.
It is the literal exact opposite to what I said in the actual interview to Sarah Lamarquand and Stella, which is that I ignore trolls. They don't have any bearing on my real life. I care about the opinions of people who matter to me and who are important. When I say that, again, people find a hard time believing that you can get the level of abuse I do and not care about it. I really don't give a stuff what some anonymous moron thinks about me online. I just don't actually care. And I'm not saying that to try to put a nice blush on it or whatever. I literally don't actually care. So I think sometimes people have a hard time kind of, processing all of that. But the reality is I am leaving because time's limited in life, right? I'm 49. I have so many ideas all the time about things I'd like to do. 7:30 is a massive job. There's limited time to do those things. And I mean personal life things as well as work things. And so, the clock's ticking away all the time, and I'm going to run out of time to do everything I want to do. And so it just feels like at the end of an election cycle, and after I've been doing it so long and where I'm in this position where people still, respect me doing it, it feels like a great moment to go, yes, I've done everything I can do there, and it's time to move on to a new challenge. And it literally is as simple as that.
The other narrative that people like whenever a powerful and successful woman decides to make a change in her career is that you can't have it all and that feminism's failed.
So true.
And that it's not compatible having a high-powered job with a young family. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, you're so right. That is the other thing that people immediately reach for. It is hard to have a high-powered career and a family. It is difficult. And I think, when the other people say, you can have it all, but you can't have it all at once. You can. It just takes an enormous amount of juggling, and it takes an enormous amount of assistance and other people kind of chipping in to help. So, for example, my boy's father is really good at chipping in and doing, what's needed to help care for the boys, or suddenly being called on to have to change his plans because a major story is broken and I have to go to work. I've had the same nanny for almost their entire lives, Honor, who is just the most extraordinary person. And, I can leave the kids with her and I feel as assured as if they're with me. My great close friends, Annabelle Crabb and Gwen and Miranda Murphy and people like that who've been around to help me when something unexpected happens and I can't keep all of the balls in the air, and they swoop in to assist with a kid or do whatever. Or my friend Nick, who drove around on short notice the other day because my car wouldn't start and the battery was flat, and whatever he was doing, he just put aside to replace my car battery 2 days after the bloody federal election. So it takes all of that. You can't just have plan A, you've got to have through about plan H, especially when you're a single mother. And so, that is difficult, but you can do it. But I think what you have to think about is, and I've spent a lot of time in the past 18 months thinking about, is what do you want your life to look like? And what I don't want my life to look like is the level of stress that it's had for the past, decade really, while I've had the kids, which is I wake up every morning. I feel like I'm in a hurry constantly. I wonder what I'm forgetting. Stuff falls out of my brain all the time. I'm not fast at responding to my friends' text messages. I don't see enough of my friends as I want to. I get home from work. I'm tired. The kids are now at an age where they want to talk when I get home from work. They get the dregs of me because I get home late, and so I'm knackered. And so I don't want to operate like that anymore. I've been able to do it, and I could keep doing it, but I actually don't want to do that anymore. So it's that thing of identifying, what's important to you, what do you want your life to look like. This is, of course, a luxurious position to be in, because some people it's, I need to earn this amount of money because I have to put food on the table for my kids. And those are calculations I have to make too, again, because I'm a single mother. I can't just go, oh, well, I'd like to just, step away and have a suite of projects. Like I kind of need a salaried job so I know what I'm doing. I can't take huge risks. I can't kind of go out and just make Chat 10 Looks 3 my thing. The other point I'd make around the, having it all kind of thing is that most women I know, we have conversations a lot about getting women into more senior roles in workplaces. Most women I know feel like we barely have our heads above water juggling all of our existing responsibilities. And so the last thing we want is to take on more responsibility at work. And that's because it's really hard to juggle that with our home responsibilities. There was an amazing piece last week in the paper that had some research around the way that home responsibilities have altered. And when you looked at it, was broken down into two things. One was caring for the children. And amazingly, that had almost equalised between men and women. What was still unbelievably disproportionate on women was mental load of running the house and organising children's activities. So, and, I think a lot of people would relate to this, that your partner or your husband will be awesome at taking the kids to netball or whatever, as long as you tell them and you've enrolled the kids in netball. So you just have to still run everything. And so that was, I think it was something like 80% of that load still fell predominantly onto women. And any women listening to this will know how full on and draining and exhausting that is. Like, I was sitting at the Logies, and I actually mentioned it to Justin, my boss, who was sitting next to me. I was sitting at my table at the Logies, texting my nanny to the groceries list of what could I get her to pick up the next day, and giving her the plan for the morning for school drop as I'm sitting at the Logies, because that was the first window I'd had to actually do that. And I think that's, you know, the kind of thing that women relate to, that's your brain is ticking the entire time about, okay, what have I got to do tomorrow? I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And it's really exhausting.
My favourite stories from women are the ones where worlds collide. I know there's a story about when you were pregnant and interviewing Penny Wong.
Oh, yeah. So actually I had two funny things with Penny both times when I've been pregnant. So the first time I was pregnant, I was at the midwinter ball in Canberra Parliament House, hadn't announced it publicly yet, and I was sitting next to Penny and her partner was sitting on her other side. And when I announced a few weeks later that I was pregnant, Penny rang me and she said, I knew that you were pregnant because you and Sophie were pushing away identical food on your plate. And she was expecting her first child as well. And she said, I looked at what Sophie, and it was also a secret, so I looked at what Sophie was doing, I looked at what you were doing, and I thought, she's pregnant. And she said, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to, you know, breach your privacy, but I knew it. Anyway, then when I was pregnant with James, so a couple of years later, I interviewed Penny, and I forget who her counterpart was at the time. She was in government at the time. And the start of the interview was slightly delayed because I felt sick. And then I had to do the interview with a bucket in the studio next to me because I felt like I was going to be sick. And Penny rang me afterwards and she said, you know, and I know that you're pregnant again. I was cacking myself. I was going, Penny, literally both times that I've been pregnant, you've known before my own mother.
Because didn't you have to say to Penny, look, if the vision cuts out, keep talking. I'm just having to have a little vomit.
Yeah, I was like, you guys have to just keep it going and you'll see me disappear. They'll kill my mic and then I'll come back in, but you're going to have to just keep it kind of going, you know, the perils of live television.
Did you ever have to do that?
No, I haven't ever thrown up on air. It's a constant terror actually with the kids because, you know, young kids always have gastro and stuff. I remember one time, you know, when your kids are young and they have gastro, I hope I'm not the only evil person that thinks this, but I'll often think when they're being sick, I'll be like feeling the pits of despair thinking, oh God, I'm going to have this in 12 hours. And it's just that sense to let you know that you're getting it, definitely. So I remember one time the kids both had gastro and so I was like, well, this is going to be striking any moment. Right. So you're always worried live television if you know there's a bout of gastro looming. Anyway, I got home at about 9:15. I started feeling really sick and then I was really crook. I remembered I texted Justin and said, yeah, I've got it, but phew, it's 9:15. It's no problem.
I'm out the other side.
I'm out the other side.
So to speak.
Oh, it's going to be such a pleasure to kind of be able to live my life and not be worried that I'm going to like throw up on live TV. It's going to be good.
In terms of the demands of the way things have changed, not just with Twitter, but with people not tolerating other points of view, because that's a new thing. It used to be, I disagree with you. Now it's, I disagree with you. You must apologise and take it down or, you know, delete it from the public record. Have you noticed a big shift in that we're just not able to tolerate opinions we don't agree with anymore?
Yeah, and I find it fundamentally disturbing and because I believe in free speech, I think it's really, really concerning that you can't just go, well, I disagree with that, but whatever. Or even, you know, hateful opinions that you wouldn't just go, well, you know, I disagree with that and I think you're a dickhead, but it's your right to believe whatever nonsense you want to believe. The other thing I find really disturbing is, so we have a very, when I say we, really what we're talking about again is the kind of cancel culture mob on Twitter. There's a very low bar for mistakes. So you misspeak, you word something awkwardly, you can find yourself at the end of a gigantic pile-on. And that can happen like that. There can be real-world consequences for that. We've seen it over and over again. Universities have sacked people or magazines have sacked people. Doesn't matter what their record is. They could have an immaculate record, but, you know, one misstep, you're out the door. So even when people apologise now, forgiveness is very hard won. So it's a low bar for being cancelled. It's a high bar to be forgiven and for people to give, like I sometimes wonder whatever happened to that saying, the benefit of the doubt. Like, oh, yes, Mia said something a bit clumsy or Leigh said something a bit clumsy, but generally speaking, we know her to be a person of good character who's done a lot of good in the world, and so therefore we'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Whereas now it's like, no, sorry, you are a sexist or you are a racist or you are a, bigot or whatever it is that gets directed at you. So I feel like if we're going to have these very stringent standards that we hold people to, surely we have to have a willingness to forgive people and give people space to be human, because what it's going to do is it's going to discourage people from doing jobs like mine, because when you're on live television or even doing an interview like this, you and I have been talking off the top of our head for the best part of 45 minutes. As a human being, you can't be certain in that period of time that you're not going to say something that offends somebody or that you're not actually going to say something offensive. You might actually make a mistake and say something wrong. So if we get to the point where society is so censorious of people that we're all scared to even say a word for fear of offending somebody, we're going to be in a very bad place. And so I'm hoping somehow that we're going to have some kind of correction to some of the stuff we've seen happen. Of course, some of the stuff we've seen happen is valuable because you want to call out sexism and racism and all that kind of stuff. What we don't want to do is have these just gigantic bullying episodes of people that do incredible harm. I'd recommend everyone read John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which talks about the consequences on people who, even when they've done stupid things, find themselves with lynch mobs after them online. It's really disturbing and it's a sad trend.
Just finally, because I know you have to go and do your day job, I know you're working on a speech about the things you've learned about human nature. Off the top of your head, what have been some of the more unexpected things that you've learned?
I think that humans are unbelievably adaptable, and the things that you think, if that happened to me, I'd never survive it. I'd rather be dead than that happen to me. Almost everyone that you talk to who's experienced something that you yourself in your head would think that. That's not how people feel when it actually happens to them. Humans are unbelievably adaptable and resilient. There's a lot of truisms that actually aren't true, like, for example, hard work pays off. There's many examples in life where people have worked incredibly hard and just because of luck or happenstance or wrong timing, the hard work hasn't paid off. So the thing that's coming to my mind is Hillary Clinton. She runs in 2008. It's Barack Obama, once in a lifetime amazing candidate. So she's an amazing candidate. She's worked really hard. It just didn't pay off. Happens all the time in politics as well, where you might have, everyone on both sides, the winning and the losing side, is working incredibly hard, but one side is still going to be the losing side. And then Hillary Clinton again, of course, with Donald Trump. So there's that. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't actually necessarily believe that to be true. I think sometimes people are permanently weakened by things that happen to them and just profoundly changed by the burdens that life kind of puts on them. I think it makes you different, rather than stronger. So I think they would be the probably most unexpected things. There's probably some, I don't know that this is unexpected, but just things like if you want to achieve highly and reach goals, we all know that that's going to involve probably failure. Like, you have to be prepared to embrace failure. But I also think working at your capacity means you have to be prepared that most of the time you're going to be operating in a space that makes you uncomfortable because you're always at the limits of what you're capable of doing. And that's not a very comfortable place to operate. So many times in my job, I feel uncomfortable, like anxious, scared, fearful, because I'm operating right at the limits of what I'm capable of doing. And so I think you have to be prepared to embrace that and understand that this is going to come with feeling uncomfortable, but the feeling at the other side of having done it is great because it's partly relief because you get away from the feeling of discomfort, but it's also that sense of accomplishment that I pushed through those kind of hard feelings.
Did you have a catheter in on election night?
I did not have a catheter in, but I wasn't drinking water from about 1 o'clock. That's the only way to get through it, I'm afraid. Because you're on for so long, I think it was about 6 hours this time. It's been 6 hours every time I've hosted it, and it just seems we can't have a quick election these days. And so Annabelle and I often talk about literally limiting our fluid intake to try to
like bodybuilders.
Like bodybuilders, exactly. That's right. We look really buff by the end of election night, me and Annabelle.
Really good muscle definition. That's why you do it.
Exactly.
I love you. I thank you. And if Twitter's done one thing in its life, it's introduced me to you. That's how we became friends. So
exactly, yeah. And it's, it did in the early days, Twitter, it was wonderful for all the kind of eclectic people that you met that you wouldn't have come across,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'll always be grateful for that too. I made some beautiful friends out of Twitter, you chief among them.
I love you.
Love you. Talk to you soon. Mwah.
Did you love that? That's Leigh Sales, ladies and gentlemen. One of my favourite Leigh stories is that after she interviewed Shane Warne, I don't know if you saw that interview, it was replayed just after he died recently, and she knows nothing about sport, but still, she really found him to be so engaging. They got on really, really well, and you can see that through the interview. Like, he's a bit reticent at first, like he's kind of like, what does she want to talk to me about? But part of her skill as an interviewer is immediately putting people at ease, whether they're Shane Warne or a Prime Minister during an election campaign or a treasurer on budget night or someone who's just experienced an enormous tragedy. So this rapport that she develops with her subjects often carries on, and she tells the funniest story about how she and Shane, I think they were both promoting books at the same time. She was promoting Any Ordinary Day and Shane was promoting, I don't know, he'd probably written an autobiography or something. And so they would have these text banters about who could sign the most amount of books in the shortest amount of time. And they'd have to do these book signings and they'd just be like trying to beat each other because Leigh's also very, very competitive. I hope you enjoyed that. You know where to find Leigh. She's on the television. She's on a podcast. Please buy that book if you haven't already. Please buy that book for someone who might have suddenly experienced a tragedy or a sudden change in their life. I was sort of dreading reading it because it sounded really grim. Interviewing people like Walter Mikak after he'd lost his wife and his children at Port Arthur, or people who'd suddenly lost loved ones in awful circumstances. But it was actually, I had to read it obviously because she was my friend, but then I just loved it. It was so engaging. It was so conversational, and you saw a side of Leigh that most people don't see, but also she just brought such humanity and nuance and context to these stories. It was just a beautiful, beautiful book. Anyway, No Filter is produced by lots of people at the moment because Liz Ratliff, who's the executive producer, is away. So it's been a cast of thousands involved in this one, and I'm grateful to every single one of them. This podcast was made by Mamamia. If you want to support women's media, we'd love it if you became a Mamamia subscriber. There is a link in the show notes.